Some of you may be aware that I did my PhD in governance and fiscal management, particularly focusing on public debt management. During that time, I subscribed to the IMF to receive press briefings, Article 4 reports, etc. Now, they recently had a meeting, and I'm going to be sharing with you some snapshots from that meeting. In that meeting, they mentioned the shutdown of the US government, and so at the end of that synopsis of the IMF briefing, I will share with you a report from the BBC on the US government shutdown and implications. Enjoy. Your questions are welcome.
Questioner: I had a question about inflation and sort of how the IMF is viewing inflation in the global economy that's being caused by tariffs. What we're seeing in the marketplace is that companies are kind of slow to raise prices for consumers. They've been absorbing a lot of margin, but I'm just wondering if the IMF is starting to see that shift a bit and to see more companies raising prices. What is the impact on inflation from that? And also, as part of that question, does the IMF have concerns about the quality of data that we're starting to see coming, especially out of the US? Given the questions over data collection, now we have a government shutdown, which is going to not give us a jobs report on Friday, and other data could also be affected by that. Will we not be getting sort of a clear picture of what is really happening in the economy? Thanks. MS Kozak. Okay, thanks very much. Are there any other questions on these topics? Kind of inflation and data? Questioner: I guess I wanted to just ask, 6 months after the tariffs have come in, how do you see the inflationary impact of those tariffs in terms of sort of a one-term effect or a longer lasting effect? And if I may, on the question of Fed independence, I'm just wondering if your view has evolved at all. We've had obviously the court case brought against a sitting Fed governor. You have the head of the C temporarily sitting as a Fed governor as well. I just wonder how the IMF is viewing those developments in the context of Fed independence and the importance of tackling inflation. Thank you. MS Kozak. Okay, very good. Questioner: my question is on US government shutdown and what is the impact by the government shutdown not only on the US economy, and also on the general meeting, US general meeting this month. And on top of that, yes, there are many concerns on government shutdown or US labor market weakness, but stock prices, US stock prices have updated records almost every day. And is there any concerns on potential deep correction in the future? And my last question is on the Federal Reserve's appropriate rate path. And without data, what is your view on the future rate path of Federal Reserve? Thank you very much. MS Kozak. Anyone else on these topics? Let's just ask online. Questioner: can you say what more specifically towards the Fed shutdown? What implications has IMF done? Any assessment, early assessment, to state what possible implications are there for the broader context of the US economy, as well as those countries, especially the small developing countries, who are economically dependent on the United States? MS Kozak. I don't see any other questions, so let me go ahead. So let me start with the global picture, and then I'll move to the US. So maybe just starting with where we see the global economy in broad terms. We have seen that the global economy has shown resilience amid persistent uncertainty. We see global growth in the first half of the year having held steady, but we are starting to see signs of a slowdown globally. Now, with respect to inflation, what we see globally is a bit of a mixed picture. So we do see some countries where headline inflation, particularly outturns fairly recently, kind of showing some upward pressure. So we've had stronger prints with headline inflation in the UK, Australia, and India. For example, in the US, we see some evidence of pass-through of tariffs to prices, and we see that in core inflation. And then we have countries where inflation pressures are very muted. For example, in China and some countries in Asia. So I think globally on the inflation side, we see a fairly mixed picture, and part of that may reflect the fact if you recall back from the April year, when our economic counselor, our chief economist, Pierre-Olivier Gourinchas, was talking about, for some countries the increase in tariffs would be a supply shock, particularly for the country imposing the tariffs, but for other countries, it would act more like a demand shock and that could be suppressing inflation. Maybe specifically on this issue you were asking about what's happening with companies within firms. We do see firms absorbing some of the tariff impact, so that seems to be part of the contributing factor to the fact that we've seen relatively limited impact so far on inflation in the US. How long that will last, I think, is a question, and that's something obviously that will be covered in more detail both in the WIA, which will be released in 2 weeks, and also then of course, in the US article IV, which will take place in November. And then let me now turn to some more US specific questions, because there were quite a few of those regarding the questions on the US government shutdown. What I can say here is that we're obviously monitoring developments carefully. Given that it's early days, we are still forming our assessment of the potential impact of the shutdown, and of course, that impact will depend very much on the duration of the shutdown and the modalities of the shutdown, and we certainly hope that a compromise can be found to ensure that the federal government remains fully funded. On the question on asset prices here, what I can say is that if you look at recent editions of our Global Financial Stability Report, or GFSR, we have raised concerns about stretched asset price valuations, globally. And that's both in the equity market and in some cases in other financial markets, and we will have an update of that assessment in the upcoming GFSR, which will also be released the week of the annual meetings. With respect to, there were some questions on Fed independence and US monetary policy. What I can say is, I think our position is quite clear. Independent but accountable central banks are an important policy tool. Independence helps increase the credibility of central banks, so it is important for central banks to retain independence, but to do so also with accountability, and I think we've been clear on that. With respect to the future rate path for the Fed, given the situation in the US, we do see a softening labor market, and we also see that inflation is on a path toward the Fed's target, but it's subject to upside risks. So our view is that the Fed has appropriately lowered the policy rate at its last meeting, and that the Fed will have to continue to monitor the incoming data closely as it considers its next policy decision. And then I think there was one question on data and data quality, and here what I can just to maybe talk to the broad principles, which are that, of course, in the US, at the IMF, we are very supportive of, strong data quality and transparency of data. This is important for policymakers generally across the world, and it's something that continues to be very important for all of our members to have good and reliable data and statistics. Why the US government has shut down and what happens now. What could happen during the US government shutdown? Article information author, Anthony Zerker, North America correspondent author, James Fitzgerald, the 29th of September 2025 updated the 2nd of October 2025. The US federal government has shut down after Republican and Democratic politicians failed to resolve a budget dispute. It means that some, but not all, US government services are temporarily suspended, and 40% of the federal workforce, about 750,000 people, are expected to be put on unpaid leave. Although budget confrontations are common in US politics, this spending fight is especially tense because President Donald Trump has drastically reduced the size of the national government since taking office, and has suggested he may use the current impasse to make further cuts. Why has the US government shut down? The shutdown happened because Republicans and Democrats could not agree to pass a bill funding government services into October and beyond. Under the US system, the different branches of government have to reach an agreement on spending plans before they can become law. The Republicans currently control both chambers of Congress, but in the Senate, or upper chamber, they are short of the 60 votes needed to pass the spending bill, which gives opposition Democrats some negotiating power. They want to see an extension of expiring tax credits which make health insurance cheaper for millions of Americans, and for a reversal of Trump's cuts to Medicaid, a government health care program used by millions of elderly, disabled and low-income people. Democrats also oppose spending cuts to government health agencies. A stopgap bill designed to avoid the shutdown was passed in the House, or lower chamber, but did not clear the Senate. And so, at 0:01 EDT on Wednesday the 1st of October, 4:01 GMT, it became official. The US had its first shutdown for nearly 7 years. Which government services will stop, and which will carry on? Not all aspects of government will shut down. Services deemed essential will continue as normal, although in many cases staff will not be paid for the duration of the shutdown. Border protection and law enforcement staff, immigration and customs enforcement, ICE agents, in hospital medical care and air traffic control workers are expected to operate as usual. Social Security and Medicare checks will still be sent out, although benefit verification and card issuance work may stop. Government employees deemed non-essential will be temporarily put on unpaid leave. Contractors who work for federal agencies but are not directly employed by the government will miss out on work. 2. Services like the Food Assistance Program and federally funded preschool and institutions like the Smithsonian Museums will likely be reduced or closed. Several agencies, like the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, CDC, and the National Institutes of Health, are also expected to furlough many workers, affecting ongoing research projects. National parks and forests remained open during the last shutdown in 2018, but with few or no staff, which experts said led to a rise in vandalism, littering and looting of historical sites. There could also be travel delays. The Airlines for America trade body warned that flight systems might need to slow down, reducing efficiency. Passport agencies have also warned that it could take longer than usual to process travel documents. Jobs, travel, national parks. What impact will the shutdown have? 18 ways the 2018 shutdown hurt. Mail will still be delivered and post offices will remain open because the US Postal Service does not depend on Congress for funding. Most American schools are state funded, but the federal government is responsible for billions of dollars in grants and student loans, which could effectively come to a halt. However, because the grants are typically awarded during the summer, they will be largely unaffected during this shutdown. According to the Education Secretary, members of Congress will also still be paid, a convention that has been criticized by some politicians. How has the White House responded to the shutdown? In the past, lengthy government shutdowns were usually seen as politically dangerous, hampering voters' everyday lives and the reputation of lawmakers and the president. After previous shutdowns were resolved, government operations mostly returned to normal, with staff and spending levels largely going back to what they had been before. However, this time, the White House appears more than happy to shutter large parts of the US government for an extended period. Over the past 9 months, the Trump administration has slashed government spending and sacked many federal workers, testing the boundaries of presidential power. Officials have threatened to use the shutdown to identify more non-essential workers who could be permanently let go. "We'll be laying off a lot of people," Trump said on Tuesday the 30th of September, the day before the shutdown began. White House says layoffs imminent while both Democrats and Republicans are blaming each other for the current standoff. They did make last-ditch efforts to try to avoid it. On Monday the 29th of September, Trump met all 4 congressional leaders, the top Democrats in the House and Senate as well as their Republican counterparts, but little progress was made, and both sides appeared to dig deeper into their positions. How long will the current shutdown last? It is difficult to say. In this case, it really depends when, or if either of the parties will agree to a compromise. The Republicans could negotiate an extension to the healthcare subsidies demanded by the Democrats. Alternatively, the shutdown could become so disruptive that the Democrats decide to back down and agree to fund the government, at least temporarily, to get things up and running again. So far, the Trump administration has been unwilling to offer substantive concessions. It believes the Democrats will bear the brunt of the public's blame because it argues the party's demands caused the shutdown. Meanwhile, the Democrats believe their efforts to secure cheaper health care are popular. The party's congressional leaders provoked the ire of some left-wing activists for backing down during the last budget dispute in March. Many Democrats seem to be itching for a bigger fight this time around, and funding the government is one of the only places where the party has some leverage. 4 ways this shutdown could end. How could the shutdown affect the economy? The scale of the damage will depend in part on how long the shutdown lasts, and how wide-ranging it is. Analysts estimate it could shave roughly 0.1 to 0.2 percentage points off economic growth for each week that it continues, although much of that could be recouped, as has happened after previous shutdowns. That relatively muted impact may be why the stock market seems to be shrugging off this latest threat. But if Trump ends up firing workers, rather than temporarily putting them on furlough, the impact could be more substantial. The US economy has already been hit by the effects of Trump's tariffs, with the likely delay of key data, such as the official US monthly jobs report, expected to add to the uncertainty. What tariffs has Trump announced and why? What happened during the last US government shutdown? Shutdowns over budgets are a unique aspect of US politics. They have become quite common over the past 50 years, with 3 taking place during Trump's first presidential term. The last shutdown in late 2018 lasted 35 days, the longest in history. It was brought about by disagreements over funding a wall on the Mexico border. It finally ended in part because air traffic controllers, who had been working for a month without pay, started calling in sick en masse. Flights were cancelled or delayed because of the lack of staff, and the shutdown came to an end shortly afterwards. The Congressional Budget Office, CBO, estimated that the 2018 to 2019 shutdown reduced economic output by about $11 billion, including $3 billion that it never regained. But shutdowns predate Trump. The second longest to date was 21 days, under Democrat President Bill Clinton in 1995. His fellow Democrat Barack Obama had a 16-day shutdown during his time in the White House, and Republican Ronald Reagan oversaw 8 shutdowns during his presidency in the 1980s, though all were relatively brief.
We have no interest to critique the governance of any country, but we do have an interest in governance and fiscal management, particularly in countries like the United States of America, whose economy affects other countries globally as trade partners and otherwise. If you live or work in the United States of America, you will want to pay keen attention to the news coming out of the US, news coming out of the IMF and the economy in general. Have a good day.